The night shift at St. Vincent Hospital carried a kind of cold noise that never stopped. A mix of monitors and rushed footsteps that made the air feel tight. Nurses moved quickly from room to room while residents tried to manage a growing list of emergencies. And in the middle of it all was Emily Carter, quiet and steady as she checked vitals, adjusted monitors, and organized what others had left scattered on the counters. Dr. Lauren Hale brushed past her with a sharp reminder to stay on basic tasks, and a few younger physicians copied that behavior without thinking, treating Emily as if she were invisible unless they needed something simple done. She accepted their instructions with a calm nod even when her hands worked faster and cleaner than theirs. Emily kept the supply carts arranged the same way every night because it helped her think. But the others whispered that she was overly rigid or too timid to handle real pressure. She counted syringes and color-coded tape rolls, while a resident joked that she cared more about labels than patients. And she let the words slide past her, as if she had not heard them at all. The truth sat quietly behind her eyes, a weight she carried without complaint, and it made her posture look smaller than it should have. She blended into the noise of the ER, even though she moved with precision that no one bothered to notice. Each shift settled on her shoulders like another reminder that she was being overlooked. And the unfairness hung in the air with every rushed command she received. Yet there was a tension beneath her calm, a sense that something stronger lived inside her, waiting for the moment when it could no longer stay hidden. Emily Carter moved through the hospital with the calm rhythm of someone who wanted her life to feel simple. But beneath that quiet exterior was the history of Staff Sergeant Emily Hartman. Lieutenant Mark Hayes looked at Emily with a respect that needed no explanation, his posture straightening as he acknowledged what she had just done. The hospital staff who had followed to the rooftop stared from the doorway, stunned by the quiet nurse who now moved like a seasoned combat medic. Emily stepped back once the tube was secure, her breath steady and her eyes focused only on Cole's recovery. She chose the hospital because it felt like a place where no one would look too closely at her past. She wanted the routine of civilian medicine and hoped the steady pace of ordinary emergencies would help her forget the ringing sounds and the smell of dust that followed every memory of Dakra Pass. Even in the middle of a shift, a slamming door or the sudden clatter of a dropped tray could freeze her breath for a moment before she quietly forced herself back into motion. No one around her noticed the way her hands sometimes trembled before she steadied them on the counter. Her habits in the hospital were more than preference. They were survival. She organized supplies with the same discipline she once used to prepare field packs, because order made her feel safe. She counted equipment the way she once counted minutes between medevac calls, grounding herself in anything predictable. Every quiet moment she created was a small attempt to disappear into a life that expected nothing from her. Yet the heaviness of who she had been followed her through every hallway, a weight she carried alone because she refused to let anyone see how much history lived behind her silence. The construction worker arrived in a blur of shouting voices and rolling wheels, his arm torn open and the bone clearly fractured, while bright arterial blood pulsed in sharp bursts. A young resident tried to pack the wound but pressed in the wrong spot, and the bleeding surged harder as panic rose around the bed. Emily Carter stepped closer without thinking, her mind slipping into the old rhythm she had learned in places far harsher than this brightly lit room. She counted the seconds in her head, the same countdown she once used under fire, and felt the world narrow to the sound of the heartbeat she could still hear beneath the chaos. She crossed the sterile line as if drawn by instinct and reached for the exact point on the upper arm where the brachial artery could be pinned against bone. Her fingers pressed with controlled force, not too wide and not too shallow, and the arterial spray stopped in an instant that felt almost unreal. The room went quiet, except for the monitors as the resident stared at her with wide eyes, unsure how she had turned the crisis so sharply. Emily held the pressure steady until the team regained their footing and moved in to stabilize the patient. Once the bleeding was controlled, she stepped back and tried to disappear into the edge of the room again. She murmured something about reading the technique in a medical text, avoiding every curious glance that followed her. The staff still whispered as she walked away, unsure of what they had just seen. Emily lowered her head and returned to stocking supplies, trying to bury the part of herself that surfaced only when someone's life hung in the balance. The blast hit just after the shift had settled into its usual rhythm. A deep rolling sound from the old military storage site a few blocks away that made the windows shake. Within minutes, the ambulance bay flooded with stretchers carrying people burned, bleeding, or drifting in and out of consciousness. And the ER lost any sense of order as alarms mixed with shouted instructions and the scrape of equipment being pushed out of the way. Nurses rushed to clear beds while residents tried to sort patients by severity. But the flow was too fast and the injuries too heavy for anyone to keep control. The room felt smaller with every new arrival, packed with bodies and noise and the smell of smoke. Dr. Lauren Hale tried to take charge and shouted for scans, labs, and transport. But her words overlapped and contradicted each other as the pressure pushed her toward panic. A private contractor arrived in near collapse with a catastrophic abdominal wound, and his blood poured onto the floor in a steady rhythm that marked how close he was to dying. The operating rooms were full and unavailable, and the attempts to pack the wound were useless against a severed renal artery that kept releasing blood with every heartbeat. The staff hesitated around the bed, unsure how to slow something that felt unstoppable. Emily Carter stepped forward when no one else could make the bleeding stop. She pushed past the chaos and reached deep with a steady hand to apply manual aortic compression, finding the point against the spine where she could halt the flow at its source. Dr. Hale snapped at her to stop crossing lines. But Emily stayed focused until the spray cut off and the room fell silent. The sudden stillness made everyone look at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. Without raising her voice, she had taken control of the moment that had been swallowing the entire ER. The doors burst open again just as the team worked to stabilize the last critical patient, and a line of Navy SEAL operators moved into the ER with a speed and purpose that cut through the noise. Their uniforms were dusty and marked with smoke, and their focus locked instantly onto the stretcher carrying Lieutenant Jason Brooks, who had been rushed in among the others. The moment their eyes landed on Emily Carter, something shifted in their expressions. A sharp recognition that did not belong in a civilian hospital. One of the operators spoke her old name with a certainty that made the room fall still, as he called her Staff Sergeant Emily Hartman. Emily did not look at them as she worked, her hand steady over Jason's wound, while the staff froze in place. Jason fought for breath, his eyes cloudy, then cleared just enough to find her in the blur around him. He whispered that she had saved their task unit at Dakra Pass, and the words carried through the ER like a sudden drop in air pressure. Doctors and nurses stared at her as if they had never seen her before, torn between disbelief and the weight of something far larger than the chaos they had just endured. The chief of staff arrived with a folder he had been forced to open after the SEALs identified her, and he read the declassified record in a voice that shook with shock. Lieutenant Mark Hayes looked at Emily with a respect that needed no explanation, his posture straightening as he acknowledged what she had just done. The hospital staff who had followed to the rooftop stared from the doorway, stunned by the quiet nurse who now moved like a seasoned combat medic. Emily stepped back once the tube was secure, her breath steady and her eyes focused only on Cole's recovery. The room felt charged with a new kind of silence, as everyone understood they were witnessing the past and present collide. And the quiet nurse they had overlooked stood revealed as someone far more formidable than they had ever imagined. The rush to the operating room felt like a blur of wheels, shouted updates, and the steady drop of blood that marked how close Lieutenant Jason Brooks was to losing his fight. His liver laceration was deep and messy, and every second counted as the team pushed him through the hallway. Dr. Lauren Hale tried to take command, but her voice wavered, and her eyes kept drifting toward Emily Carter, as if she could not reconcile the quiet nurse with the soldier she had just learned about. The uncertainty in her tone made the rest of the team hesitate, leaving a void that someone needed to fill before Jason slipped away. Emily stepped forward with a calm that did not match the urgency around her, guiding the team without crossing any legal boundaries. She directed the surgeons through the early steps of damage control, outlining what they needed to see and where the likely source of the bleeding would be based on the wound pattern. When they exposed the liver and struggled to control the flow, She instructed them to use the Pringle maneuver and explained the pressure and duration needed for it to be effective. Her voice stayed even as she reminded them about Jason's old shrapnel injury near the L3 area and the need to angle the clamp gently to avoid tearing weakened tissue. The room tightened around her words, and for a moment the entire team moved in sync with her experience. Jason drifted in and out of consciousness as the bleeding slowed, his face pale and drawn, but still fighting. In a brief moment of clarity, he looked toward Emily and told her she had never failed at Dakra Pass, speaking in a faint voice that held more truth than anyone else in the room could understand. He said the team had hidden the full story to protect her mind, not because she had done anything wrong. The words hit her harder than any blast she had survived, stirring a pain she had buried deep. She realized the guilt she carried for years had never been hers to hold. The past and present collided in that small space, and while the surgeons worked to close the wound, Emily stood still for a breath, feeling something heavy lift from her chest for the first time since the desert. The morning after the crisis, the boardroom at St. Vincent felt heavy with the kind of silence that only follows a disaster narrowly avoided. The leadership team reviewed the reports from the night before and saw how close they had come to losing multiple patients because they had dismissed Emily Carter's abilities. Dr. Lauren Hale stood before them and acknowledged that she had allowed hierarchy to guide her decisions instead of competence, admitting that her rigid approach had nearly cost lives. Her voice carried a mixture of remorse and clarity as she explained how Emily had stepped in when no one else could. The board members shifted uneasily as they listened, confronted with the reality that their own system had failed under pressure. They voted to create the Carter Response Unit, a trauma stabilization team designed to act in the critical moments before a surgeon could take over. And they granted Emily the authority to bypass certain protocols in Level 1 emergencies. The decision sparked immediate tension as several senior surgeons argued that it was unacceptable for a nurse to hold that kind of operational power. They pointed to their years of training and questioned how someone outside their hierarchy could direct action in a crisis. The pushback revealed a deep divide between tradition and necessity, exposing the fear many felt in the face of change. Yet the facts were impossible to ignore, and Emily's actions had already proven that the old structure could not keep up with the reality of modern trauma care. The room felt like it was shifting, as if the foundation of the hospital was forcing itself to evolve around her competence. It marked the beginning of a new chapter that some resisted, but none could deny. Emily Carter built the War Med protocol from the same training that had kept her team alive overseas, shaping it into a system the hospital could use in the first crucial minutes of trauma care. She taught digital hemorrhage control with precise finger pressure, showing staff how to stop catastrophic bleeding long enough for a surgeon to take over. She introduced high-stress simulations filled with loud alarms, flashing lights, and overlapping commands to push the team into making decisions while their senses were overwhelmed. The 3-second reset became a core skill, a fast method to break panic by grounding the mind with simple observations before returning to action. The senior surgeons struggled with every part of it. They said the drills were too intense and the noise unnecessary, and they bristled at the idea of learning battlefield-inspired methods from someone outside their hierarchy. Some insisted that a hospital was not a war zone and never should be, and they muttered that Emily was dragging combat into a place meant for calm precision. The moment their eyes landed on Emily Carter, something shifted in their expressions, a sharp recognition that did not belong in a civilian hospital. One of the operators spoke her old name with a certainty that made the room fall still as he called her Staff Sergeant Emily Hartman. Emily did not look at them as she worked, her hands steady over Jason's wound while the staff froze in place. Jason fought for breath, his eyes cloudy, then cleared just enough to find her in the blur around him. Emily stepped in, located the correct site at the second intercostal space by the midclavicular line, and performed a needle decompression with a large bore angiocatheter in one controlled motion. The sharp hiss of air releasing cut through the noise and made the entire room go quiet. The surgeon stared in an uneasy silence, confronted with the effectiveness of a technique they had dismissed as unnecessary. Emily kept her expression steady as she explained the signs that guided her, and how the same steps had saved real lives long before she came to St. Vincent. The clash between tradition and the reality of trauma care hung over the group. And for the first time, several of them began to understand that her methods worked faster than the system they were defending. The elderly pedestrian arrived in rapid decline, his skin pale and cool as the team rushed him into a bay. Dr. Alvarez tried to place an IV, then tried again. But each attempt failed as the man's peripheral veins collapsed under the strain of shock. The monitor alarms grew sharper and the patient's breathing weakened. And panic tightened around Alvarez until his hands shook visibly. The room edged toward another loss, one that everyone felt coming before anyone spoke. Emily Carter stepped in with calm authority that cut through the tension. She told the team to switch to an intraosseous line at the proximal tibia and reached for the battery-powered IO drill with steady hands. She located the right point, pressed the needle against the skin, and drove it through the cortex in one smooth motion, then flushed the line to confirm placement. As the massive transfusion tubing connected and the fluids began to flow, the patient's vitals lifted enough for the room to breathe again. Weeks later, during a large-scale mass casualty drill, Alvarez froze when the alarms blared and the noise filled the simulation space. His mind locked up just as it had before, and the scenario stalled around him. Emily moved close enough for her voice to reach his headset and guided him through the 3-second reset, grounding him with simple observations until he could see the field clearly again. His posture changed as he took command and directed the team with confidence he had not shown before. After the drill, he approached her with humility in his eyes and thanked her for helping him find the courage he thought he lacked. Emily accepted the words quietly, knowing his growth mattered more than anything she could say. He walked away with a new respect for her methods and a better understanding that they were never about bravado, only about saving the life in front of him. 6 months after the creation of the Carter Response Unit, St. Vincent Hospital looked and felt like a different place. The save rate for penetrating trauma had risen by 31%, and medical teams from across the country came to study the new model that blended civilian care with battlefield precision. Hallways once filled with quiet skepticism now carried a sense of pride as staff moved with confidence, shaped by the skills Emily Carter had taught them. She trained them without raising her voice, focusing on steadiness instead of authority. Emily remained the same calm presence she had always been, but now the people around her understood what her silence carried. The staff watched her work with a respect that had grown slowly and honestly, built on the lives saved rather than the medals she had never displayed. Her approach brought the team together in a way no policy ever could. She became the quiet center of a system that finally understood the value of decisive action. When the Navy SEAL Task Unit arrived for the ceremony, the atmosphere shifted with a mix of pride and reverence. The men stood in full dress uniform, forming a line that led to Emily as the team leader stepped forward. He placed a unit patch into her hand, the same one she had earned years earlier in Dust and Fire, and she pressed it over her chest as a sign of trust and shared history. The room fell silent as everyone realized the depth of the moment. Emily did not smile, but her eyes softened with a warmth she rarely showed. She had never asked for recognition, yet here she was, honored by the people who knew exactly what she had carried and what she had given. The moment marked a quiet shift, a small acceptance that her past and present could finally stand in the same place. Emily sat alone in her office with the soft hum of the ventilation filling the quiet, her Silver Star citation resting in her hands. She remembered the early months at the hospital when her fingers would turn cold the moment an alarm sounded, her body trapped in memories that arrived faster than she could stop them. Now, those same alarms brought a steady sense of readiness, a reminder that she had turned fear into purpose. The shift felt subtle but powerful, like the slow thaw of something that had been frozen for years. Doctor, Lauren Hale stepped into the room without the authority she once carried, moving instead with the openness of someone who had learned a hard lesson. She thanked Emily for saving more than patients, admitting that Emily had helped her rebuild her professional identity by showing her a kind of precision that mixed urgency with long-term healing. Emily listened without arguing, then explained that trauma itself was a form of violence, and survival often depended on what happened in the first minutes. Not on titles or years spent in training. The room remained tense until she demonstrated one of the most debated skills in the protocol. During a simulated tension pneumothorax, the staff froze as the mannequin's vitals plunged, and the scenario spiral grew louder. Her history no longer felt like a chain she had to hide, but a tool that shaped the way she saved lives now. The weight that once held her down had shifted into something steadier. When Hale left the room, Emily sat for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around her. She felt a peace she had chased for years, not loud or dramatic, but warm enough to fill the space where fear used to live. Her past no longer trapped her. It carried her forward. Emily walked with Lieutenant Jason Brooks through the hallways of St. Vincent, their steps slow as they passed the new charts displayed along the walls. Each graph showed the climb in trauma save rates, a steady rise that traced back to the work she had done and the training she had given. Staff members moved with a confidence that had not existed before, shaped by skills that were now part of the hospital's rhythm. Jason watched her quietly, understanding more than anyone what it had taken to reach this point. They stopped outside the staff locker room where Dr. Lauren Hale stood on a small step stool, fixing a new banner above the door. The message on it read that seniority is measured by action, not titles, and the words settled over Emily with a weight she felt deep in her chest. It was a lesson the hospital had learned through trial, loss, and change, and seeing it displayed so openly felt like a quiet victory. Hale stepped down and met Emily's eyes with a gratitude that needed no explanation. Jason turned to her and offered a crisp salute, not out of formality, but out of respect for everything she had carried and everything she had given. Emily placed her hand over her heart, the gesture she once used in the field to signal shared responsibility, a promise of standing together. It felt right in this new place she had helped rebuild. As she stepped outside for the first time in years, without feeling like she was escaping anything, the air felt warmer and lighter. She glanced down at the SEAL unit patch sewn over her chest pocket, no longer a symbol of pain, but of acceptance. The leadership team reviewed the reports from the night before and saw how close they had come to losing multiple patients because they had dismissed Emily Carter's abilities. Dr. Lauren Hale stood before them and acknowledged that she had allowed hierarchy to guide her decisions instead of competence, admitting that her rigid approach had nearly cost lives. Her voice carried a mixture of remorse and clarity as she explained how Emily had stepped in when no one else could.